What is going on, guys? Shooting Dave here, so good to see your faces. Welcome back to the channel. Now, if you're new here and you don't know what I'm about, I'm a photographer from London that now lives here in Los Angeles, and I make photo and video editing tutorials, so if that sounds of interest to you, then please do consider subscribing. Okay, today we're heading to downtown LA to a place called Lower Grand. For those of you who don't know, it is a super overused place to go and photograph your car in downtown LA, and being the basic guy that I am, I figured I'd go and shoot my new car down there, so why not? Now, the technique that I'm going to be using today is a bokeh panorama, or if you're more into wedding photography, it's probably known as a Brenizer method. Now, Ryan Brenizer is the one that came up with this idea. Essentially, what you do is you set your focus point onto the subject, you then turn it into manual focus, and you shoot a huge panorama. Works best with long lenses when you're nice and close to the subject, and basically what you're doing is stitching an image together, so you have a razor thin, shallow depth of field on your subject, but the rest of it is just lost into this world of creamy bokeh, and it looks super cool. And today, I figured I'd do that with my car. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about the technique and how you go about doing it once I get there, but for now, I'm just going to enjoy the drive on the way down to downtown LA. So, I'll see you guys in a bit. Okay, so this is going to be kind of the shot that I'm thinking about. I'm going to be using a 135mm f2.L lens on a Canon 5D Mark III, so we're going to be much more zoomed into this, so we'll actually be much closer to the car, but by stitching, what we'll end up with something like this. And I think I want to try and include some of this cool architecture above, just give it a really wide, kind of field of view, and lots of depth of field and lots of bokeh, and that'll look really nice, I think. Alright, time to get shooting. One thing to bear in mind when you're shooting panoramas like this, you don't want to use autofocus. So if you have back button focusing, just set your focus point on the car and then don't touch that button again, and then just carry on shooting like all around the car. If you don't have back button focusing, what you can do is just use your focus point, autofocus on the car, then switch the lens to manual focus and then just start shooting around. So what I did with the 135L is I focused on the headlight, I then shot down, 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 up, 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 and basically just did it all the way around, stitching them all together. So what we're going to do is go into Photoshop after this and then stitch them all together, and then hopefully, fingers crossed, I didn't miss any areas, and we've got a nice looking bokeh panorama, and it looks pretty cool. Now, I know this location is overused, but I mean, it is pretty damn cool. I love all these leading lines, I love these pools of light, and what's pretty wild is how much the light has actually moved. This light over here is not actually the sun, that's light being reflected off the skyscrapers like up above, so that's pretty cool. Okay, so I'm back after shooting at Lower Grand, and this is the final result. Now, you might not realise this, but this image is actually ginormous. There's 44 images that went into making this bokeh panorama, and a single frame would actually look like this. Okay, so you might be wondering, I don't see what the big deal is. Well, consider the bokeh panorama. Now look at this image taken with the same camera and same lens. It is a single exposure. Note how the background is nowhere near as pronounced and out of focus as it is on the bokeh panorama. You can't achieve this level of blur using any single lens or any single exposure. So bokeh panoramas really open up the opportunity to knock that background completely into oblivion and give you a really nice shallow depth of field with a creamy, atmospheric looking background. But I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself. I probably should explain how I actually shot this image. Now, the gear that I used was a Canon 5D Mark III with a Canon 135mm f2.L lens on it. However, you don't need to use the same kit that I did. You can actually use any crop or full frame camera that you like. And as for lenses, well, you don't need to use the 135mm f2.L from Canon, although I would go for that if you can, because it's my all-time favourite lens. But in my experience, I find anything from an 85mm to 135mm works best for this. However, you do feel free to explore any shorter lenses or even longer lenses if you want to. Now, as for your aperture, you want to be shooting as wide open as possible. This is an f2 lens, which allows us to get loads of light in there and render that background nice and out of focus. I would say anything with a minimum of f2.8 is probably going to be a good starting point. You can try with an f4 and f5.6, but I would try and get a wider apertured lens if possible. And also, as I mentioned whilst we're shooting, you want to use manual focus other than the first shot. So basically, you pick up your camera, you focus on it, that's your first shot, then you turn your lens into manual focus and you shoot around the scene, capturing all the images that you want. I use back button focusing, which means there's a little button on the back here, and when I press that, it allows me to make the lens autofocus, and when I let go of it, it goes back into manual focus. So I basically just held it up and pressed that button once, and then I've got my focus, and then I don't have to worry about it shifting each time I'm taking a frame. And you don't want it to shift, because the whole point here is you want the rest of it to be out of focus, so we get a razor thin depth of field and the image pops off of that dreamy looking background. Once you're done shooting, it is now time to bring your images into Lightroom. Now, I will stress that when you're editing this panorama together, you're going to want a beefy machine. I have a MacBook Pro from 2017, it's a 13-inch, and it's pretty highly spec'd. However, it still struggled when I was stitching these 44 images. I actually shot 104, and there's no way that I could actually get my MacBook to stitch all those together, so I had to whittle it down to the 44 selects that I used, and then it was able to do that. And even then, I had to actually make those selects and then render them out of Lightroom as 4K TIFFs to save on file size before actually creating the panorama. However, now we're in Lightroom, and assuming you've got a beefy machine, I'm going to go through the steps you need to do in order to make this panorama. It's pretty straightforward, so let's get straight into that. The first thing I like to do is the same with any photos that I take. I like to remove all chromatic aberration and apply the lens corrections that they have in the profiles on Lightroom. I also make a few exposure tweaks. Maybe the exposure was a little bright and I wanted to bring it down, and I like to try and recover some of those shadows and highlights. This is typical of every photo I do. It's always the first step I go and do, and once I've done that, I select the first image that I made those adjustments on and then synchronize them across every other shot that I took. Once Lightroom has finished synchronizing your edits across all of the photos, select them all, go up to the top, hit photo, go photo merge, and then you want to select panorama. Now, at this point, you might want to go and make yourself a cup of tea or any other refreshing beverage, as this might take a while.
Approximately 10 hours later.
Once Lightroom has done its best job of aligning the images, you're going to be presented with a dialog box asking which kind of projection that you want to use. For this, I actually used spherical, as I felt that one looked best for me, and I left all of the settings turned off because I wanted to do all of the editing myself and manually in Lightroom. Once you're happy with that, hit merge, wait a little bit longer, and you'll get a merged image that you can start working on. There really wasn't anything fancy that I did on the editing stage. I basically cropped it down to a 4x5 portrait photo that I wanted, because I knew that I was going to be posting this on Instagram, and I just went through and did a couple of color grades. There are new color grading wheels inside Lightroom, and I wanted to have a little play with those, adding a little bit of blue into the shadow and a bit of orange and yellow into the highlights, and then putting a bit of cyan into the midtones. So really nothing complicated here. I went through and dialed in the exposure and the white balance to my taste, and then played with the curves a little bit, giving it a little bit more contrast. So you guys know what to do inside Lightroom. Have at it, choose whatever settings you want to use, and it'll be dependent on every scene, so there's no real point copying my settings. However, if you are interested, here they are right now. And there you have it, guys. Now you know how to create a bokeh panorama or Brenizer image or whatever you want to call it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you don't need to use anywhere near as many exposures as I did. I just wanted to get nice and tight onto that car so the background was really out of focus. I actually did this technique a few weeks ago up in the mountains with my car on the sunset background, and I used around 7 to 9 images on that. So I'll overlay that now so you can have a little look at that. So hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial, guys. It's just a nice creative way of shooting to get shallow depth of fields, much more shallow than you would do out of a normal lens, and hopefully you can put this to good use. It also increases the resolution of your photos that you're taking, so if you're looking to print on large format, then you have no problems doing so right now. Using this technique allows you to get a much more shallow depth of field than you would with any single lens on any single exposure. And you can get as wild and creative as you want with it. Like anything in photography, composition is king, so you can play around with putting things in your foreground or placing a subject closer or further away to your background. And that is all from me, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any comments or questions, let me know down below. Follow me on Instagram. I am @ShootingDave, and if you use this technique, do tag me in those pictures. I want to see what you guys get up to. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe. And as always, guys, I've been @ShootingDave, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.